such a joy to have you all here tonight. When I look out and see such a broad and diverse audience, we do okay filling the church on Sunday mornings, but it feels a little bit like Christmas or Easter seeing this place so full. It's a joy to have you all here. As we say just about every Sunday morning here at First Church, welcome no matter where you are on the journey of life or faith. I'm Reverend Dan Smith, a senior minister at First Church in Cambridge here, and when Lauren Taylor called us to ask if we could offer a venue for our hosts and distinguished guests, I said, yes, please, that would be a gift to First Church. Our congregation has a long history of relationship with Harvard. We too celebrated our 375th anniversary, and we go all the way back to the very beginning with Harvard. This is our 6th meeting house, built in 1872. And I say that because this is not only a place, a sanctuary where we worship together, but it is a place of public meeting and public conversation about important matters. And tonight is no exception. So please do make yourselves at home in this place. One Sunday morning from right about here, following the earthquake in Haiti, one of our members, who is a physician and who went to Haiti with Partners in Health, offered a moving and memorable testimony about his experience there. And I know he wanted me to share his thanks. Also, our congregation is partnered with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. And through that work, we have deep relationships with members of the local Boston Haitian community. I've heard from them directly how meaningful and important the work of Partners in Health and Dr. Farmer is, and I would be remiss if I did not pass along that community's thanks tonight as well. Please just scooch in if you need to. We've got a full house. Pull your jackets onto your laps so that there is room. Having said all of that, it is now my honor to introduce one of our hosts for this evening, Dr. Ahmed Ragab, Faculty Director of the Science, Religion, and Culture program at Harvard Divinity School.
Welcome. Is it working? I don't think it is. So until it works, welcome everybody. We are very happy to host this event, and we are grateful that you came on such a cold day. This event is a conversation about the book In the Company of the Poor by Paul Farmer. And before I talk about our speakers or about the book, please let me thank First Church and Reverend Dan Smith for their hospitality here, for offering to host us here in this great sanctuary. And let me thank my team in Science, Religion, and Culture, who have been working for weeks to put this event together. It's really a wonderful effort, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to be working with you. This event is part of our initiative on religion and health in a global context, which is coordinated by Lauren Taylor, who's moderating our event today. Lauren is a Master's of Divinity candidate and a presidential fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. Her first book, The American Health Paradox, co-authored with Elizabeth Bradley, came out in November 2013. The book, In the Company of the Poor, invites us from its title and throughout its different chapters and its overall message to think about healthcare in relation to liberation theology. In this journey of the book, liberation theology becomes part of a new journey where it provides an ethical grounding for a different type of global health. But also the title of the book and every single chapter of it invite us to ask questions about the poor. Who the poor are. What can we think about the poor? After all, liberation theology, whether in Latin America or in its different incarnations in the Black church in the United States, in Africa, or even in its non-Christian incarnations in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East, in all these different types of liberation theology, or may I say, liberation theologies, it challenged us to be the poor, to become one with the suffering, with the downtrodden, with the marginalized, with those who are marginalized for economic reasons, for political reasons, for their sexual orientation, for their gender, for race, for culture, for all sorts of and types of marginalization. Liberation theologies in general were also a way not only of giving priority to these marginalized, but also a voice of the marginalized. A new discourse, if you will, coming from down up. A chance for the marginalized and the downtrodden to say something, for the voiceless to finally have a voice, to create a discourse that would express their own views, their own hopes, and their own problems. If we are to think about healthcare in terms of a liberation healthcare, how can this healthcare become also something that is produced by the quote-unquote the poor or the marginalized? How can it be formulated in this way so that it's not only expressing or coming to them, but it is also produced by them, or should we say, by us? There are no better people to answer these questions and to think with us in these issues and other issues than our two speakers today. Paul Farmer, as we all know, is professor of social medicine in the medical school. His work in global health all over the world is something that probably every one of us knows. And he is the author, the co-author of the book that we're discussing today, In the Company of the Poor. My friend David Carrasco is a professor of Latin American studies at the Divinity School, a historian of Mesoamerican religions, and a professor of anthropology. His work, particularly on questions of race and culture, and his discussions that we had here at the Divinity School with Cornel West, changed the way we think about race and culture in the Americas in general. I could go on with their biographies, but that will consume the rest of the evening. So we have an extremely short version of their biographies in extremely small print, printed in the back of your programs. If we go any bigger, we would run out of space, so have to bear with us. So with this, I leave this podium, and Lauren, you can lead us off.
Great.
Thank you very much.
My mic works. Thank you so much, Ahmed, and thank you all for being here. It's been an incredibly exciting few weeks for the Science, Religion, and Culture program at Harvard Divinity School as we planned and worked with our partners at Partners in Health. But this event in particular also is incredibly exciting for me personally, and that's because both of my kind of passions are represented here in our two guests. I started my career in public health, and I did a master's in public health and was working in research before I came to the Divinity School. And when I go back into health circles, as I've been doing this fall with the book, I'm often asked, Divinity School? Did you get lost on the way to the lab? You know, what are you doing in Divinity School? But I've always felt very strongly that there is something about these two disciplines that really needs to commune in order, particularly for global health, to take flight the way I think we would like to see it. Conceptually, I felt like the Divinity School was a place where we could really find an ethical grounding for global health that would make it sustainable over the long term. And very pragmatically, I saw something in the ministerial skill set that's very interested in the practice of listening, partnering with vulnerable communities, acknowledging and affirming suffering, that really made me think that I could do better work in the field by virtue of working on those ministerial skills. I'm going to run through just a few quick logistics, one of which is that we are live streaming this conversation this evening, so if you could just silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already, that would be really useful. These two gentlemen I know both have incredibly global reach in their work, and so I expect we have a number of very interesting and diverse folks tuning in. So I encourage people who are watching over the live stream to tweet your questions or comments at SRC@Harvard, and I have my phone up here and we'll check it occasionally, and hopefully we will take a question from the live streaming audience when we get to the Q&A portion. My role for the evening is really just to kind of keep an eye on time and help with the translation process between David and Paul, although seeing them at the reception, I think there will be no concern. There will be plenty to talk about. And so with that, I think I will tee up David with the first question, and it's a grand one. What did you think of the book?
Should I leave now? I don't know what time and culture made podiums that were so small. But it is a great pleasure for me to be here at First Church with Professor Ahmed Ragab and Lauren Taylor, and of course Paul Farmer, for this discussion about this wonderful book, In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Gustavo Gutierrez. I stand and approach the podium because in my tradition, the Mexican tradition, one stands in the presence of an honored person. One stands in the presence of a person recognized for great merit and value. And Paul Farmer is such a person. And so I stand to speak to him and to you and to us about this book, which I consider to be a kind of cruce de caminos, a crossroads between the thinking and the life of Paul Farmer and the thinking and the life of Gustavo Gutierrez. And as I read this cruce de caminos and enter into it, I become one of a growing number of readers. I hope many of you here have it. And it leads me to learn and question as we go along with this dialogue that is ignited once again here tonight, a dialogue between Paul Farmer, a doctor, and the great priest and liberation theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez. But I'm speaking not as a theologian, nor as a medical doctor, but as an historian of religions, interested in religious experiences, sacred places, and redressive actions in the lives of humans, but especially human beings in Latin America, and especially Latin American people who are here. I'm drawn to the life experiences and thinking and writing of both Farmer and Gutierrez, and I seek to contribute 5 questions to this evening's exchange. First of all, I taught a course here at Harvard in the fall with your teacher, Arthur Kleinman. The name of that course was Quests for Wisdom, Religious, Moral, and Aesthetic Experiences in the Art of Living. And I see Arthur's touch in your ideas and writing. Arthur insisted in this course, the Quest for Wisdom, that we were not so much about wisdom, we were about the quest, the ordeal of the quest for it. And that quest for wisdom, according to Arthur Kleinman, the medical anthropologist, so many of us here at Harvard, he insisted that it meant working effectively with other people in order to bring good into the world. Arthur stated that he knew this sounded naive and simple-minded, but he insisted it's very important for students to think that part of their goals of an education at Harvard is to know how to work effectively with other people to bring good into the world. Even though we at Harvard relish in complexity of our data, the complexity of our theory and interpretations. Matter of fact, you come to a Harvard classroom, and you won't be in there 20 minutes before somebody says, oh, it's more complex than that. We got to look at the complexity of this. And complexity is a good thing. But sometimes being simple is as important as being complex. Arthur's insistence about working effectively to do good in the world forced me to admit and question, well, it seems to me it's very difficult sometimes to know when it is you're doing good in the world, even though you claim to be doing good in the world. This problem of not knowing if one is really good in the world led me to remember my college summers, which I spent in the poverty-stricken barrios on the southern side of the island of Puerto Rico. We worked in sanitation projects, libraries, and community organizing. And I remember writing back home to people, and in my journal, I'm having the time of my life with these people in these projects. Working with Tito Cruz and Sergio Garcia and Puerto Rican people who not only shared with us everything they had, but also did what they could to protect us from the dangers that they faced every day. We students from college, going from the north to the south. But a crisis came to me when we returned to the campus as something like heroes because we had been doing good in the world down there in Puerto Rico. And we had to face the whole campus. There was a campus-wide assembly. Every student came to hear of our accomplishments. And I realized I just couldn't find a way to tell the truth about what I had seen and discovered in Puerto Rico in those barrios of tremendous poverty. I couldn't bring I couldn't find my way to articulate what it was like to live inside of that poverty because I hadn't seen it before. But I was kind of shoved on stage by the others and said, hey man, you can do it. I didn't know how to talk about the poverty, the depletion of human opportunity, the ill health, the sheer vulnerability of the Puerto Ricans in Ensenada or Calle or Aguirre. I honestly didn't know how to take off the mask of our success and show the immensity of the meagerness that we dwelt with that first summer. And the confusion and anger I felt at myself was compounded by the fact I didn't understand how this poverty had been created. I didn't know how this poverty had been structured. I remember the very first morning I woke up in Puerto Rico. I was living in the sugarcane shacks with sugarcane cutters. And one of the members in the shack had this terrible attack. And we had to take him to the hospital. And we carried him out. He was yelling. He kept yelling, my leg hurts so bad. My leg hurts so bad. We thought he had some injury in his leg. And we took him over to the hospital, and it was really a big mosquito net where there was a nurse there. And we asked her, this man is really sick. He's struggling. Help him out. And she said, well, you know, el médico viene un día sí y un día no. The doctor comes some days and he doesn't come the other days. And we left him there thinking he had something wrong with his leg, but an hour or two later they came and said, Johnny Santos se murió. Johnny Santos died of a cerebral hemorrhage, of a brain explosion. And it struck me, how could I go back and tell this story to my college students who wanted to see us as great people of success? And I realized then that knowing how to do good in the world was so complex and hard. But you and Partners in Health, you have done great good in the world, whether we tell it simple or we tell it complex. But here's my first question, especially for the students who are here, who look to you, and maybe to me somewhat, but certainly to you as a kind of model, a model for their future careers, especially those students who are going to read this book and get to know your work better. Tell us two examples, one inside a classroom and one outside a classroom, where you became motivated or gained some understanding and energy to work effectively with others and do good in the world. And when I say inside the classroom and outside the classroom, what I'm meaning is, you come to a place like Harvard and people will work hard in the classroom, but they'll say, oh man, I got my best lessons outside of the classroom. Well, it's not true. It's not true. Don't be sorry about the good lessons you get inside the classroom. And I'd like to hear him talk about a good lesson in the classroom and one out of the classroom that led to this book. The second question, why this book now? Why this book now? What is the significance of this book for us? What does it mean that a doctor has gotten into a long-term conversation with a liberation theologian with a kind of approach to theology and community that the military units in Latin America, that the Catholic Church in Latin America and Rome, that the Reagan administration said, don't pay attention, don't allow that liberation theology to have a voice. And here's Paul Farmer, in this year, forming a relationship and going public and saying, I and Partners in Health, who've done such profound work in Rwanda and Haiti and Chiapas, I want you to know that my Partners in Health has been fed by the theology of liberation. But why this book now? And what does it mean to us? Because this book says that it wants to, what Paul Farmer says in this book, in an essay called Health, Healing, and Social Justice, he says, liberation theology pushes the analysis in two directions. First, to seek the root causes. Second, to elicit the experiences and views of poor people, and to incorporate those views into all observations, judgments, and actions. I thank you, Paul Farmer, for helping to bring Gustavo Gutierrez's name, work, and liberation theology to a wider, spiritual, hungry public. Some of us may not know that it was the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, a mestizo, mixed Quechua and Spanish descent, who coined the term liberation theology in his 1971 book, A Theology of Liberation. And he said, I come from a continent in which more than 60% of the population live in a state of poverty and 82% of them find themselves in extreme poverty. It was Gustavo Gutierrez who said, poverty is not a fate, it's a condition. Poverty is not a misfortune, it's an injustice. It's the result of social structures and mental and cultural categories. It is linked to the ways in which society has been built in its various manifestations. Elizabeth Huesler Fiorenza is here tonight. She knows about this. Harvey Cox is here. He knows about this. This Gustavo Gutierrez, who military regimes and others turned against and identified as dangerous. But you've been inspired by his hope and his preferential option for the poor. Why now this book? And what impact is it going to have? And to what extent, we students, are we going to join with Paul Farmer in this book and Gustavo to make sure that it has an impact and this message goes out from here? So that's my second question. Why not? Number three, and I'll move through this so we can hear from Paul. This book seems to me to be two books intermingled. His essays written as a man of faith and your essays written as a man of medicine. My reading is that you are trying to do a work of translation, a new translation of several texts and processes, including liberation theology, into the work of Partners for Health. Along the way, you and Gustavo Gutierrez attempt to develop, quote, a comprehensive commitment to healing the world. But to do this, you work to give new meanings to words traditionally captured by conservative Catholic lexicon. Conversion is used a lot in this book, a word that usually meant also attacking indigenous ways of living. You use evangelization, which often led to the byproduct of destroying indigenous cultures, but you don't mean that. There's a lot in this book about spirituality. It used to mean focus on things from another world. So I want you to do two things for us. Tell us what you mean by at least one of these words in your secular medical work with the poor. And secondly, it seems to me that this work of translation, like all translations, is incomplete. I'm not persuaded yet that you and Gustavo have sufficiently translated the word spirituality into medical practice. But we want to know what you mean so that the next generation of people can further the translation, develop the translation further. The fourth question may be a little more challenging. You describe Gustavo Gutierrez.
Okay, thank you. It's not what I expected.
Are you ready to go? You describe Gustavo Gutierrez and his theology of liberation as about hope. But I read these essays to show that he's as much a man of faith. And in the Catholic Christian world, that's not the same as hope. And in fact, faith in Gustavo Gutierrez's teaching is what ignites hope into action. Allow me to quote him on page 31. The essay is called Saying and Showing the Poor That God Loves You. He says, Gustavo Gutierrez says, Jesus bears witness to the kingdom of God through his words and deeds, and the healing of the sick has a prominent role in his work. Jesus healed the leper, the paralyzed, the blind, the deaf, and many others who suffer disease. All of this was a message, says Gutierrez. As the Acts of the Apostles says, Jesus passed through the world doing good. And Jesus not only healed the sick, but he allowed the sick to participate in their own healing. Very often Jesus told them, your faith has saved you. But my dear brother here, he doesn't mention faith too much in his book. I don't think you mentioned the word God too much either, and that's all right. Though you do talk about God talk. And so I guess I'm doing a little God talk here. For Gustavo Gutierrez, God and Jesus are not only the models, they're the center of his enterprise. I'm not asking you here to talk of your own personal faith, but where are God and Jesus in the word, in the work of Partners in Health? This seems to me a pertinent question given tonight's theme and where we are after all. Finally, what do you see as the specific future for the Partners in Health energized by a revival of liberation theology? And what do you hope for the future of liberation theology made manifest in Partners in Health? And in the case of your work in Chiapas, Mexico, Chiapas is the poorest and Mexico's most indigenous state, where Partners in Health will be treating people. Those indigenous people, they have larger cosmologies than Catholicism. They have larger cosmologies than what you even have in other parts of Mexico. What's the future? Let me put it this way. You have an ongoing project there now. I'm very grateful to be part of it by helping with teaching some of these students who are working there. I'm pleased to be a part of that project. But I'm reminded of the great essay on the Chiapas and the Bishop of Chiapas, Samuel Ruiz, by John Womack in his great book, Rebellion in Chiapas, and I'm coming to the end. Womack recounts that the bishop, the great bishop, Ruiz, who did so much in Chiapas, said, I went there to convert the Indians, and they converted me. And one of the key moments in this conversion was when a group of Indian wise men confronted him on the church's work among them. They presented him with 3 tough questions. What happened was the church said, we want to find out how good we're doing for the indigenous people. So let's do a study and let's involve the people themselves. And the people, the Indians, came and said, okay, now we're going to tell you how you've done with us. We have 3 questions for you, dear bishop. The first question is, does the bishop's God want to save our bodies as well as our souls? Number 2, they said, if the work of God is like a seed that is found everywhere and already a seed of salvation, can we not assume that these seeds are to be found where we live in the mountains and the forest. Therefore, why should we come to your centers and your church? Why don't you come out there where we are, which is where Partners in Health is going? The bishop did not know what I know about this question, that for the Indians, when they speak of seeds in the mountain, they really are speaking of their ancestors who dwell in those mountains. But the third question, Paul, is the one I have for you. The Tseltal Indians asked him, and they could be talking about you and your medical folk. Quote, "You have lived among us and shared our lives. We regard you as our brothers and sisters. Is it your desire to be our brothers and sisters for all time?" So, Paul Farmer, how long do we go on together in our accompaniment with the poor? What do you see as the next steps that you and we must take together? What will you tell the audience here about what must be done next? Thank you.
Well, I was hoping for a light, breezy conversation. Thank you, David. I didn't take any notes. I may have to turn to Lauren for help, but I certainly would like to start the conversation, the dialogue, or with others here as well. I feel like the easiest way to start, which is something I need to do, you know, it's sort of like sitting next to Martin Luther King Jr. and then being asked to talk, is to think a little bit about your first question first, about things one can learn in a classroom or, again, through reading or books and things that you can learn outside of a classroom as well. And when I was working on this book, I had occasion to think back to both those questions. 31 years ago, I was lucky enough to, in between college and medical school, to go to Haiti, and it changed my life. But I went there prepared. And I don't say that with any great pride. I just have met so many people in Haiti, or go right through the list, who are not prepared, who have not tried to prepare. And what I meant by prepared is I certainly knew about liberation theology by then, having gone to college between 1978 and 1982. This was a very difficult time, as you know well, in Central America. And one of the experiences I had after having really rejected the Catholic faith that I grew up with was wondering why it was that in Central America, in places like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, people were willing to put their lives on the line, and that in order to promote dignity and social justice and an end to oppressive regimes. Mm-hmm. That was one question, pretty basic for any citizen of the United States, I think. Unfortunately, not questions that we posed as much as we should have back then. And I remember the day, actually, that Archbishop Romero was murdered, and I just couldn't believe that it would have happened during a Mass, as he was saying it, and not understanding what was at stake. And that's really why I started reading the liberation theologians, curiosity about what was going on in Central America. And I can't say I read them very deeply. I never took a class, like the kind of class you teach here. So my experience in the classroom was really in anthropology. I took my first class in anthropology as a college student. This is at Duke University. And it just somehow seemed to lead me to ask questions about, as one is supposed to do taking classes, ask questions about how poverty worked in the modern world. To go from a setting of affluence and ease to just a couple of hours away to see farm workers. Most Latino, but many from Haiti, to see farm workers laboring under conditions that in 1981 were termed slavery by the U.S. justice system. So the U.S. justice system actually tried some growers, farm growers, on slavery charges in that year. It was my junior year of college in the state of North Carolina. And it just seemed to me right then that because of things that I learned in a classroom or in a university, that the world opened up for me. And that's why I teach. That's why I teach not just medical students and physicians, or teach with my colleagues in places like Haiti and Rwanda and elsewhere, but that's why I teach at the college. And whenever I can, talk to people who are my age when I saw the world open up before me. And that's intellectually, because I didn't go anywhere. I didn't go more than, a few hours away from the campus or my home state of Florida or my adopted state of Massachusetts until after I went to college. And I share that often with students. Say, don't disdain what you can learn in a classroom or from a book. The path that I'm on now, along with many, many thousands of other people, and I'm talking about the path of pragmatic solidarity with Partners in Health, is to some extent the path that was laid before me in a university. In any case, that experience I would elevate and did in thinking about this book and how I could contribute to it when writing it alongside of someone who I admired so much and thought of as a hero. When you meet Gustavo Gutierrez, and there are a number of his friends here in the audience, he's a very unimposing kind of fellow by choice, not by his choice necessarily, also by God's choice. He's kind of small. I'm very regretful. I'm very regretful that in the book I called him Yoda and they didn't take that out. Yeah. It's too late now. Anyway, it wasn't an interview, not in a chapter that I wrote.
He won't mind.
No, he won't mind. It's good sense of humor. But he, in reflecting a little bit about why I felt so strongly, and you asked me these questions personally, so I'm answering them personally, because when I turn to another question about spirituality, about which I know little but have some things to say, I will reflect on the asocial nature, the asocial way we have of discussing spirituality all too often again, I'll say in the United States, but I haven't studied this formally anywhere. But back to Gutierrez and writing in concert with him. I felt that I had a lot more reflecting to do than he did, and not just because he's older than I am, but because he thought so much more about these first-order questions of doing good in the world. And that was very humbling to me just in the last few years. I've spent my life thinking about doing good in the world, and I felt that on every issue, every topic that came up, I had been nowhere near as thoughtful as he. And that was also humbling. And that's what would lead me to say things that I learned outside of give an example of things that I learned outside of the classroom. And I'll link two things together. One of them was to use your term, just the immensity of the meagerness. That was your expression, I believe. Yeah. And it beautifully captures what I saw in that first year after leaving college and before going to medical school. I had read, I said I was prepared, but prepared in some ways and not others. The immensity of the meagerness of what was available to people living in extreme poverty, which of course I've since seen all over the world, including to my shock in Chiapas, Mexico, where I saw places that were really almost every bit as poor as a poor village in Haiti. I saw places in South Africa that were just as poor as some of the places I'd seen in Malawi. And of course I saw marginalized people just as marginalized in prisons in Russia and the United States. But that first year, the immensity of the meagerness almost overwhelmed me. And when I say overwhelmed, I don't mean in a good way. I mean in a very bad way, in a way that I've seen happen to others, to make me retreat to a place where some of that immensity might be diminished, forgotten, relativized. And one of the reasons I didn't are people that I met in Haiti, including my wife, although she doesn't like it when I say that was 31 years ago. But also, we're still working with the same people now to this day. So there's something, I think, to be said for enduring all these years. I met the people with whom I would later form. I don't even like using first person here. We would form together, Partners in Health, all in that first year. But that 1983. But the fear of that immensity was a lot for me. And one of the ways that I learned something good outside the classroom was not to be a spectator to poverty, although I knew by then that I was only that, very little more. And I learned that the hard way at someone else's expense, of seeing people, young people my age, die. But back to what you can learn in a book or take from a book, it was really writings by Gutierrez in those first years that convinced me that this was a fight worth engaging in. Now, I hate to parse that as a classroom experience and something outside of classroom, because of course it was in some ways integrated. But the example, one of the examples that I give, and not willingly in this book, along with the earthquake, which again, a number of my colleagues are here from Haiti, from Chiapas, actually, from Rwanda. They didn't come all the way to hear me speak at this church, as beautiful as it is, but rather we're here for a meeting. Yeah. And it's not that easy to write and reflect on extreme suffering. Yeah. Again, Arthur Kleinman, as you said, was a wonderful mentor in that way. And to bring a little bit of levity into the discussion, because there hasn't been much yet. And I once was in Texas giving a talk at a medical school, and this is not too long ago, and this young man, this kid, I would say, came up to me and said, "Oh, Paul Farmer." And he held out his hand, and I thought he was going to say, really love your work or something. He said, "I thought you'd be a grumpy old man." And I said, "Really? Why?" And he said, "Because I've read your books." And I said, "Okay." In any case, the levity part is, by 1986, spring of 1986, I had my first job as a teaching assistant to Arthur Kleinman. And he said, "Well, why don't we do a course together?" I learned a lot from him, not just from his writing and his teaching, but his collegial ways. "Why don't we to design a course together?" And I said, "Really? I've never designed one before, but that sounds great." I said, you take it, let's not do a medical anthropology course. Let's think about suffering." And I even knew the word theodicy. I have my friend, the theologian Jenny Block, is here. She can tell you I did know the word theodicy back then. And so we did. We designed a course which had a really catchy title. The Harvard students just flocked to it: Varieties of Human Suffering. Yeah. I'm sure you can look it up on the course catalog of not very successful courses. No, I mean, actually, about 20 years later, he taught it again. Yeah. But, going between classroom and non-classroom is a very bracing experience. Mm-hmm. And that also taught me that we can do better complementing what we can read and learn through action.
We know what's interesting about this first response, and then in your case, you're born in Massachusetts, you're down in North Carolina, but it's two Latinos who really have an impact here. They're not all, but you have Archbishop Romero, who is assassinated, and then you have Gustavo Gutierrez, providing with this kind of model. So it's very interesting to see.
Now we got a third one lining up to influence me.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Francis, not David, because he's
Yeah.
already influenced me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that struck me. I was surprised when there was some interest. I got a call from a journalist writing for the National Catholic Reporter, and maybe I would get a call from Infectious Disease Weekly,
Yeah.
or I have some friends from the New England Journal of Medicine came tonight, which moved me greatly. But the National Catholic Reporter, not my bag. And I mean, it is my bag, but the interview is an interview with them. They asked me because Father Gustavo's story with the Catholic Church is his own to tell. And just as I don't venture very willingly into discussions of faith or spirituality, but I will, try. And I thought I did pretty well, even though you said I hadn't finished the translation, which is true. Father Gustavo is he's a priest. He's part of that church. He's a Dominican, as you know, and as my Dominican friend reminds me regularly. He's a Dominican,
Yes, he is.
He's a Dominican. But I would say that between Vatican II and now, let's just say he hasn't always had cozy relationships with those in charge.
Yeah.
And one of the first things the Pope did, the new Pope, I have to tell occasional stories so it doesn't seem too weighty. So,
Yes.
did you hear the one about the Pope? No, I won't do that. I was in a car in Haiti, going between a teaching hospital. Actually, Ahmed encouraged me to talk about a teaching hospital, and I will. That'll maybe work its way in. Between a teaching hospital and the airport. This is all post-earthquake, obviously. And I was on the phone, and there were 3 people in the car. A driver who I knew quite well from central Haiti, and someone who I've known for 15, 20 years, involved in the popular movement in Haiti that has undergone so many ups and downs and difficult turns. Anyway, I was on the phone speaking in English, someone at Partners in Health, and late for a meeting, and I hung up the phone, and the guy in the back seat said, "Did you hear the Pope resign?" And I said, "Who? Dr. Pope?" Because there's a Dr. Pope in Haiti. And he said, "No, the Pope." And I said, "The Pope in Rome?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Has that ever happened before?" And he said, "Yeah, about 677 years ago." So that's how out of it I am in terms of the knowing about the Catholic Church. But what I will say about this is, after Father Gustavo was invited back, I shouldn't say back, but he was invited to Rome, it was of note.
It was
to
of
people
note.
who
I
follow
heard
the
about
Latin
it. Yeah,
American
yeah,
Church.
it did.
And so, of all people, I got asked to do an interview, and I said, "Oh, sure, I'll do it." I was teaching here at Harvard College, in between the medical school and the college, and stood there and took the interview, and I realized I'm totally in over my head. I said, "What do you think this rapprochement between liberation theology and the Vatican might mean for the church?" And I said, I want to say, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I did say something that I believe in. I said, I don't know. I'm not a historian of the church or a sociologist or a theologian, but I do think it should come to mean something for the secular world. Mm-hmm. Understanding structural violence.
Yes.
How poverty is perpetuated, how racial discrimination, gender inequality come to get in our bodies, and then our social bodies. How to make a preferential option for the poor. What would that mean? Why shouldn't every foundation or hospital or school or people trying to do good in the world, back to Arthur's point, we have to understand questions like that. And that's the, it's not that I'm trying to skirt questions of faith and spirituality, it's just that, I'm writing with a theologian, who knows so much more about these things than I do. And so that's the main reason, I hope, modesty, that led me to stick to the third question you asked and the fourth one, which is how do these ideas come to inform the work of Partners in Health, which is fundamentally a secular organization, but which is trying to do good in the world. And like you said, Partners in Health is rooted in these ideas,
Yes.
and these ideas take root in us. I mean,
Yes, yeah.
you don't propagate an idea by imposing it. I would say the church in Rome had better have learned that. Ideas take root by the power that they can, the imagination they can inspire. In any case, I will go back to the questions of faith and spirituality if you force me to. I was hoping Lauren or someone would intervene about now.
I have another
Ahmed.
question for you.
I'm kidding, I'm not.
You can go. Well, I was going to ask, as a student, I thought that what David said about our efforts to do good in the world is so quintessential, not only for Divinity School students, but for all Harvard students at this moment. And yet accompaniment, as you say, is such an elastic term with such personal connotations about physical presence. And I know that's what ministry is about in many cases at the Divinity School. It's not all that it's about, but it's rooted in that personal interaction. But what would you say about how do we know when we've done good in the world? How do we measure that? Because I know that you have real reservations about how we measure good in the world now in global health, but what schematic or framework would you put forth in the place of cost-effectiveness research or straight utilitarianism that's really based in the foundations of liberation theology and accompaniment that you talk about?
Well, all three of you, Lauren, Ahmed, and David, have mentioned, I think, that liberation theology provides an ethical justification for this work. Again, doing good in the world. Now, with what right would we ever mock an idea like that it's somehow naive to try and do good in the world? I mean, that sort of idea that it's not the most important thing we can do, even in a university,
Even in the university.
makes me wonder, what's wrong with some people in the university who would denigrate the idea of doing good in the world as naive. I mean, that strikes me as perverse or worse. I don't have any real objection, though, to measuring, or attempting to measure good in the world. And indeed, any attempt to understand the effectiveness of an intervention or its cost. We talk about this all the time, not only in a medical school or a hospital, but also in the work we do together. And this book actually was a better chance than I've ever had before to really pick apart the objection that we were making to not just to using solely an economic justification for doing good in the world. That is, you do good in the world so the world does good for you. You do good in the world so that things are more good for you or those close to you or those you can see. Those justifications are interesting and dominant, but there are plenty of others that you encounter, I have no doubt, more commonly in some parts of this university than others. What I try to do, and others have been helpful, obviously, in guiding me, was to say, not only is not that the only way to measure something, but why are we so confident about measuring cost? Why are we so confident about measuring effectiveness? The history of medicine, certainly, is one long error report on both of those matters. And turns out we didn't know how to measure effectiveness. And we didn't know how to measure cost. Now, forget about price, right? Price you can measure because it is an arbitrary designation, right? And linked from cost. And cost, again, the obvious thing, just to go back, I was trying not to give story after story of some of those lessons learned outside of the classroom, which were too difficult to recount. But if, as in my not my first year going to Haiti, but again, these are people we know personally. I remember I think about it a lot, one of my coworkers, a young woman, about my age, this is back in the 80s, who had manic depressive disorder. She was bipolar. And she would go off on these bouts of mania and be brought back with medications that were not available to her in Central Haiti. There'd have to be some practically divine intervention, someone going to Port-au-Prince and getting an antipsychotic. That was the drugs that were available then. And maybe or maybe not, she would come back down to earth quickly. I became good friends with her and friends with her family, her mother, her brothers, her father. And during one of these episodes, she used to work with us. She worked in medical records in this first clinic that we built, again, my Haitian colleagues built in 1984. And I'm going back to your question, don't worry.
You'll get there.
And she was pregnant, had a child, and right after she was born, after he was born, it was a boy, she became ill with a fever and had basically what's called puerperal sepsis. She died of it. And she died in pain and anxiety, and then I saw a lot of things, not just the immensity of the meagerness, but as the days wore on and then the months, I learned something about effectiveness and cost. Mm-hmm. How do we know how much it costs when someone dies in or around childbirth? Were we so sure how to value? It turns out that her infant lived. He's a grown man now. Just got an email from him, if you can believe how things change. But how do you measure cost? And again, to dismiss that as a naive question or not one worth asking, because obviously we could do a much more sophisticated job measuring cost and effectiveness, is something that I never found to be true. It's a great goal trying to measure costs. It's a great goal trying to measure effectiveness, but inculcating some humility about both endeavors is also something I learned or reinforced by reading Gutierrez. So back to measurement in global health. I think there are good ways to measure global health. For example, chalk up one for failure in the case of that young woman, and that is measure maternal mortality, measure infant mortality, measure child mortality. These all have technical definitions, as you know, from your writing as well. Measure suffering, morbidity. Measure, try and measure all the time. Just don't be overly confident that we can assess something like the burden of disease or how much it costs to neglect it among the poor. I've never been convinced by those arguments that we can say, well, it costs so X, Y, or Z to treat AIDS in Africa, and even that then a next line that this is how much would be saved by saving those lives. What is the untallied cost of those early deaths? On what is and these questions, the cost of inaction, is a project that Jim Kim and people from Partners in Health were involved in those days when we realized that we were not going to win an argument about cost effectiveness unless we could make people understand true costs. Now, that's a longer answer certainly a longer answer than I've ever given in a church about cost effectiveness, where one isn't always obliged to make such arguments, right?
Yeah.
It's the secular world where I find this imposed, and not just by economists and policymakers. My students ask me that all the time. I taught a class yesterday,
Yeah.
and and that was the first question. how is this sustainable? Building a teaching hospital in Central Haiti, in the same town, by the way, where this young woman died
Yeah.
from not having a hospital, and where 2 other of our coworkers died. These are kids my age
Yeah.
who'd never made 30 because they didn't have.
Let me ask you a question that I get from listening to you. I think, where do you get the staying power to stay in these communities? You're talking about 30 years later, stuff is going on. I'm thinking about, our colleagues in cultural anthropology, some great teachers, wonderful friends of mine. They go down and they do 3 or 4 years of field work. And they come back and they make a career. And they kind of keep their field work up. But they don't necessarily get down into those communities. Where's that come from for you? You've sustained this involvement. You didn't go down for 5 years, do something, come back and become, you've stuck with it.
That just allows me to quote Father Gustavo in the book. There's an interview at the end, and the editor of the book is here, Jenny Block, and she said to me, my favorite part of the book, and I was hoping she'd say chapter 5, which you wrote, but no. I mean, this really long.
Yeah, on time of cholera.
Yeah. She said, no, the interview. And the last words that Gustavo says, he says, the question, I think, which was actually asked by another liberation theologian, said, this is your last day teaching. We were teaching together. And if you had one message that you could give undergraduates in this class, because they were mostly college students, what would it be? And I said something, anodyne, probably along the lines of what you asked me. What are things you can... I said something like, look, you can learn a lot in a classroom. This was at Notre Dame where Father Gustavo teaches. And I may have the paragraphs wrong, so don't correct me.
I won't, yeah.
And he said, well, the first thing I would teach them is that the first person is not I am. And in most languages, they'll tell you the first person is I am, second person, you are, or he is, etc. And he said it's you are is the first person. Did I get it right?
You got it right, man, right there.
And that's the answer to your question about staying power, too, is, it's we are. The reason that we're still there is a we. It's, whether we're talking about 10 years in Rwanda or 30 years in Haiti, there's a lot of my colleagues right over there. I work with terrific people.
Yeah.
And they're committed to the cause. And the cause, as laid out in that book, they may or may not be, Catholics or Christians, or they may be completely secular. They believe in a preferential option to the poor and fighting for it and attacking structural violence together. That's the main reason.
Well, it comes very clearly in the book. So, that message comes through beautifully.
And another reason is because, back to Lauren's question, things are getting better. Just track some of the progress being made, human progress. Yes, there are enormous problems, but you can't tell me that infant mortality, which again, I think these pedestrian-sounding measures are important. Infant mortality in Haiti is much less than it was 25 years ago. And we can make claims of causality about that, even in the face of a major cholera epidemic that reverses some of our work. Right? We know that there is improvement. I told Ahmed I would mention the teaching hospitals. To see a teaching hospital in Central Haiti that's the largest solar-powered hospital in the developing world today, where I can know that when, this was the poorest country on the face of the earth, and everyone was ready to declare it a failed state, a basket case, a disaster, no hope of recovery. But now Rwanda is meeting all the development goals, especially the health-related development goals in the so-called Millennium Development Goals. Infant mortality is plummeted to a convergence with the rest of the world. Forget about the rest of Africa. These are the steepest declines in mortality ever recorded in human history in any place. So you ask, how do you stick with it? You stick with it and you get results. You have to make the right interventions with the right people. On that, investment, to use crass economic language, is great. And there are lots of other reasons too. I mean, I like this work, and I don't prefer no electricity to electricity, or I don't have any of those tendencies. I can't even sleep without a fan. All right, so when you say down with the people, yes, I will live in a squatter settlement, but I'd like to put in electricity. I'm just getting warmed up now.
I know. Well, good. You're warmed up for the people. If we can just get a mic. So Alex, standing right over there, is going to be our mic stand. And if folks want to kind of create a line behind her, we can start doing that, and I can ask one more question. It's the moderator's privilege. Maybe you can talk just a little bit in terms of connecting the dots in terms of what does accompaniment look like operationalized on the ground in Rwanda that has an impact then on declines in maternal mortality?
A rather wry and uncharitable joke made at Partners in Health is, we use the term accompaniment so loosely that it can mean just showing someone where the bathroom is in the office. But it means something different than that. And like I said, some of my coworkers from Rwanda are here. Operationally, it means understanding that it's not about, I'll put it in grandiose terms. It's not about our own quest for personal efficacy as people coming into a very disrupted place, Rwanda. We were not there in the 90s, but 10 years ago, coming in and finding colleagues. Maybe they grew up in a village, and maybe they didn't have an advanced degree or even a high school degree, or maybe they were dying of AIDS, but thinking of them as colleagues, especially when they're better because they're on the right medicines. Again, that's the kind of effectiveness, critical thinking about effectiveness we need. Giving people a chance to do good in the world, in their own world. Rwandan professionals, or training them, saying, okay, well, there aren't many doctors. I mean, in Rwanda, there's plenty of cancer, but no oncologists. Or how do you take those kind of challenges seriously? I mean, first is you have to think it's going to be long term, and that when accompaniment is over, however you handle it programmatically, they'll let you know, right? That's another part of the question too. When have you done good in the world? Asking people in a place like that, have we done good in the world, might get you an answer you don't like, but it's probably not a bad process to ask. In any case, programmatically, you'd say, okay, we're here to provide services to the poor. And again, it's never been that difficult in my experience, and Gustavo has written more about this than I have, identifying who the poor are, because they'll usually just tell you. In Haiti, for example, that there is an overlap between the poor and the term the people, but they mean the poor. Mm-hmm. That term, the people, means the poor usually, pepla. And same in Lima, in my experience, which is not a poor city and not even a poor country, but the poor in Lima will tell you exactly who they are and where they live. Back to the programmatic part, what if you said we're here to deliver services, but we're going to use some jargon, much beloved in foundations these days, we're going to leverage our service delivery with training local people or building local capacity. That's a programmatic part of accompaniment. And what's more, knowing as we do that there's a lot of myths and mystifications about poverty and its impact on health and well-being, but also the ability to break a cycle of poverty and disease. There's a lot of myths and mystifications about it. You need to generate new knowledge. And that sounds, it sounds like saying, well, when I say new knowledge, I mean, you can call it research, You can call it illumination, you can call it epiphany, you can call it whatever you want. It's, you're generating knowledge by doing something that hasn't been done before. And again, not because of quest for personal efficacy, so much as we desperately need this kind of information. And there's no one who doubts that we need this kind of capacity building. Now, what does that look like on a grand societal level? I mean, to me, grand is a whole country. It looks like what's really happening right now in Rwanda, where there's lots of investment, as I said, in the low-hanging fruit of public health. But now, if life expectancy has doubled in the last 15 years, when mortality from these illnesses I mentioned, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, plummets, what happens? What do we see emerge as the ranking problems? And you see you do need trauma surgeons and cancer care and treatment for major mental illness. And building that capacity locally, along with your colleagues, is the work, again, of this next generation. It's not that you're done doing good in that world or the world, it's that there are more tasks. And that strikes me as a long-winded but appropriate view of accompaniment. You know, it's not over because we say it's over, like a contract in law, right? A project in an NGO with a beginning and an end, and a funding cycle and a budget. That's not how accompaniment works.
How many students are here? How many people here are students at one of the schools? Let's put your hands up here, okay? So, somebody here must have a question who's a student for this man. You know.
I think we have someone who wants to ask the first question.
Yeah, he's a student. I know that.
And the second part of it is a little bit more directed toward Paul. It has to do with your fifth question that you put to Paul, which is about the future of the role of liberation theology in medicine. Please recall, and you mentioned this, David, that liberation theology was attacked not just by the Vatican, but it was attacked by the Vatican. People were silenced, people were excommunicated. Yes. It was also attacked by the elites in Latin America, including the military, and by the United States foreign policy establishment, which explicitly noted this as a danger to American interests in Latin America, in the Rockefeller Report, for example, after he went down and visited. So here we have perhaps a rebirth of a movement that many people had written the obituary for. Liberation theology. It was dead and gone. And now, thank God, with Pope Francis, who was greatly influenced by this, and you can tell this by his first pastoral statement, and by many of the things that he's doing and saying. We have that. We have this book. We have this conversation. And it gives me a little hope that maybe those obituaries were a little premature. So I wanted to get your speculation on that. Surely these people who are endangered, who feel themselves endangered by liberation theology, are going to feel themselves endangered by its rebirth as well, because it still poses a serious threat to many of the things they hold dear. Now, my question for you, Paul, is a little shorter, which is the underlying principle of liberation theology, the preferential option for the poor, meant that you started in theology. You started reading again. Theology, Bible, church, ethics, all those things, from the perspective of the poor, the outsiders, the people who had not been part of this conversation, who hadn't been listened to. We had done the theology and brought it to them as a message. Now, I wanted to ask you to imagine a little bit. You've hinted to this in a couple of things you've said this evening. What about the poor actually making an input into, let's say, medical education, or what the practice of medicine is about, or global medicine is? Can you imagine how it might change if it weren't just a service being brought to the poor, but by those people being enlisted in the agenda and in the perspective of the whole medical work. Thank you very much again, and I hope we hear more from both of you this evening and in the future.
Deep questions.
Real quickly, just it's great to have Harvey Cox here. I don't know if any of you recently saw, he wrote an article answering his own question in The Nation. And it's absolutely, I learned a lot from that article. He went to Rome, got a chance to talk with people there, and has really deciphered, as much as anybody in the world, the whole history of liberation theology, its ups and downs, and has now been able to see that we are at a time of sort of, tantalizing hope here. Part of the problem is, of course, that Rome and the papacy, they have such influence over the way the Catholic community, as in large, embraces these theological innovations, these theological statements. I mean, the Catholic tradition has been here how long? 1,500 years? You'd think that liberation theology would have been here at least 1,000 years ago, and not seen in the 1970s as some sort of danger. Actually, Paul's on top of this because here in note 6, in a terrific chapter he writes called Health, Healing, and Social Justice, he picks this up. Let me read it to you. There are other clues that liberation theology might have something to offer the healing professions. For one, the more destructive forces hate it. In 1982, for example, advisors to U.S. President Ronald Reagan argued that, quote, American foreign policy must begin to counterattack and not just react against liberation theology. That's quoted from the Santa Fe document, a Reagan administration working paper. So you get a sense of why I'm asking Paul that second question. I think this is such a remarkable partnership that he and Gustavo Gutierrez has formed. But we've got to give Paul a lot of credit here, because he's got this other chapter in here that really lays out a way to make liberation theology a kind of guide for new types of innovations, both in theology but also in medical treatment. He's got a chapter here, Conversion in the Time of Cholera, a reflection on structural violence and social change. But he's also got this other chapter with the subtitle is Insights from Liberation Theology. You wouldn't even have theologians writing that, you see, except for some of the people, as I say, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Harvey Cox and people like that. This is a great moment, and I'm very grateful to be sharing it with you.
Thank you, David. And Harvey, let me just say before I turn to the second question that it won't surprise you to learn, again, it's not the most comfortable topic to discuss, although I've tried to write about it. It won't surprise you to learn that being drawn to liberation theology in a country where a dictatorship was being unseated by it, and to some extent, led to a certain familiarity with the impact, the reactionary forces that you mentioned, and to knowing people who were killed in those years in Haiti. And there were some spectacular crimes against the church, the Liberation Church in Haiti, as you know. And so I'm also very interested in preventing or not seeing, not that I would give myself any capacity to prevent, but to never seeing that again. And it's an Enlightenment idea, but not a bad one, that laying out, again, the utility of these ideas for doing good in the world is not only, as David said, exactly what is called for, obviously, enough, 1,500 years ago and more, but something that one has to, at least I have to believe. You could say, well, wait a second, why would you not want to do these things? Make a preferential option for the poor, making, to understand structural violence and to practice accompaniment. And I know the answer. I once said to my friend, the theologian, who by the way, tells me that, Christianity, all the good stuff happened in the first 400 years. Asking, well, why would someone want to hurt a liberation theologian? And she looked at me like, are you kidding? Don't you remember Jesus? Anyway, back to the second question. Partners in Health and many of our partners have in fact permitted just that, to bring people living in poverty, who still call themselves the poor, into our work, and also to listen to their lived experience of poverty and illness, to change the work further, to change the work plans and the budgets, back to the word that comes up all the time in our work, right? And I was lucky enough to be able to give some examples in there. That is, when something fails the poor, instead of calling it the failure of the poor to comply or adhere to the way we, let's say, prescribe a medicine or offer a service, how about we ask them what we did wrong in serving them or failing to serve them? And I'd say those two parts of the work, again, which can be laid out in great detail, how we structure certain programs. I'm talking about clinical programs to serve the poor, how we understand the importance of removing barriers to good health, which we've called these barriers structural violence. A friend of mine who's a surgeon is here in the room, in the church tonight, and even in the operating room, what we found is that for patients to get well after a procedure, we needed to pay attention to the experience of poverty on either preventing them from getting to us in time or preventing them from following some important prescription, quite literally. And there's no field of medicine where that's not true, that I can see, no field of clinical medicine. The other part, bringing poor people into the work. I think I'm proud of what we've done in Haiti especially. 70% of the employees of this massive hospital are from Central Haiti. And 70% of the entire workforce of Partners in Health are community health workers, the vast majority of whom have never had a job, any kind of formal job before. And we learn from them in our work all the time, but we also try to transform those conditions with them. So it sounds like sloganeering, in a lot of, even anything I could write, I would feel it might sound that way, or romanticizing what people without a lot of formal training and chances could do, but it's not been our experience. It's been our experience that it improves the quality of care, both by incorporating them as co-workers and colleagues, but also by listening to how they would have us change our care.
And I just want to highlight how radical an idea that is in medicine and global health. And that was a real resonance that came through for me in the book with Liberation Theology, this idea that you're trying to subvert a dominant worldview. And that is not easy work, and it gains you a lot of enemies along the way. I want to get to one more question.
Good evening. My name is Mario Melendez. I'm a first-year MD student at Boston University School of Theology. And Dr. Farmer, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Wait, you're from BU?
Yes.
You're not
I know,
allowed
I need
in
to go.
here.
Sanctuary. I'm going to put you on the spot. And Professor, if you want to answer as well. Millions of people, not just around the world, but in this country, have no access to affordable healthcare, to compassionate, decent care. Even after the very good provisions of the Affordable Care Act, access to compassionate, decent care is still a dream. So my question is, among the many things that you see in your analysis coming both from liberation theology, from your work and your work in medicine, what do you think is one of the steps that must be taken to make sure that everyone has access to decent, compassionate, affordable health care?
That's a great question. You know, can I cheat and say two? You'll allow it, Lauren? You know, if you're hit by a car and you need trauma care, right? So I don't want to forget that, or if you have acute leukemia, you need chemotherapy in a hospital, right? One of the biggest problems that we face in the United States and in many of the places we've worked is that we have almost nothing in the way of community-based care, of community health workers. So the model, lessons we learned, back to Harvey Cox's question, the lessons we learned in Haiti and Rwanda, in a place where there were no or very few physicians or nurses in rural Rwanda or rural Haiti, was that community health workers, when they had the right backup, could do the job better. And I wish we had that in the United States. I wish we had that people living with multiple illnesses, elderly or young, had access to more convenient and care near their homes and did not have to go through the difficult process of getting here and there for their fractured care. But if I had to choose one thing, it's going to sound very undramatic, perhaps, but it would be insurance. It would be a safety net. Not a safety net with big gaping holes that gets ripped ever wider in any kind of economic downturn. And you wrote about this in your book, right? Where if there's any recession or problem, the first thing to go out the door is compassionate, expert healthcare that's accessible. And there are exceptions to that, but they're very rare. The United States now, Great Britain, you know, any kind of economic contracture is followed by a contracture of social services for poor people. And that's not just healthcare, it's education, you know, food security, heating security, et cetera. And I'm thinking about the United States, I think, as you can tell. So the idea of universal coverage, or UHC, it's even being called sometime, right? Universal health care is very powerful now in global health circles, more powerful than it is right now here. And I think that's a good thing, because if we in any way sign on to that aspiration to protect people from the effects of catastrophic illness, the economic effects of their personal effects, then we will protect not just millions of people, but probably many hundreds of millions of people. And there will be problems with any insurance system, it is sure, but just that idea of saying you should not have to die because you're poor, or are about to be poor if you're sick and aren't poor but have no insurance. That's the leading cause. Catastrophic illness is the leading cause of destitution in many countries in the world, rich and poor. United States, catastrophic illness is a major cause of impoverishment of American families. So again, I wish I could say something really memorable and jazzy and David-esque. But I think that we need better ways of protecting people from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And we might as well call that, you know, better safety nets and better insurance.
David, any thoughts?
Anybody else?
Oh, one more question?
I think there are several
she
more.
was.
I know.
Yeah, line here, let's get the questions, yeah.
So I am also a student at Boston University School of Theology, so hang with us here. So my question is, for those of us who are looking at becoming interfaith religious leaders in the next couple of years, going through these programs, what is the most important advice or recommendation that you can give to us who are looking at going out into the world and serving communities to look at these problems?
Well, I think that Gustavo's comment on the first person is really you are and not I am is really about, it's about humility, and it's easy to say, right, and far harder to practice, right? I mean, we even celebrate notions as a liberal piety of cultural competence, but it's not a very helpful notion in my experience. The idea that as a graduate student, for example, you could really become culturally competent in a place, you're calling it communities, and I'm not exactly sure which communities you're talking about, but many of the places where I work, I've not found it possible to be culturally competent. But you could have cultural humility. And I think no matter what your field or what your area of study, or if you're in pastoral work, it's all obviously called for, right, much more directly, to be humble and think about doing good in the world, not as some joke that no sophisticated person would attempt, but rather the ultimate goal of your work. I think those are very helpful, if mundane sounding bits of advice. And I got very different advice, but it was complemented by some of the wisdom that I mentioned reading in these books that helped me. And then the idea of some long-term commitment, which we've called accompaniment here. And I suppose there are events and processes where short-term commitments will do, but I just don't see as many of those. Certainly the kind of problems that we've described, whether in a prison in Russia or a squatter settlement in Haiti, require long-term commitments to address effectively, as would food insecurity or a medical system that makes no sense in the United States. Those are long-term commitments. And the other is the one David gave us, is don't think there are lots of things you can learn in a book or in a classroom.
Out of respect for people's time, because we are running over, I'm going to draw this to a close for now and try and move Paul to the back, where he and Jenny, who's also here as a co-author to the book, will sign and happily chat with anyone else who has questions that are ongoing. David, last word, of course. Who am I to stop you?
Don't let him kid you about Jazzy. This man can write beautifully. I don't know if you've seen his book of speeches that he's given, graduation talks. It's a marvelous book, To Heal the World. And some of those chapters are not only entertaining and informative, but they move the reader. And they've moved me sometimes to tears because of the kind of humanity that is coming out of Paul's writing. I just want to lead you one little paragraph that ends the first chapter of the book. It's called The Doctor's Tribute to Gustavo Gutierrez. And I think it's really kind of the heart of what this accompaniment is here. And I think it's an appropriate way to bring my comments to a close, is to give the last word to Paul Farmer. He writes, as long as poverty and inequality persist, as long as people are wounded and imprisoned and despised, we humans will need accompaniment, practical, spiritual, intellectual. It is for this reason, and for many others, that I am grateful for Father Gustavo's presence on this wounded but beautiful earth. That's Paul Farmer.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. On behalf of the Science, Religion, and Culture program at HDS, I bid you good night.